close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Silk Road in the early 13th century. From distant China, long caravans of camels plod across the desert, their hooves striking against stone and sand, tiny bells chiming in the wind. From Persia, merchants drive carts heavy with ivory, spices, and precious gems, carrying stories and rumors from the warm harbors of the Indian Ocean. All of them converge on cities that glowed like jewels set into the endless steppe: Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Urgench. At dusk, Samarkand rose from the desert like a dream. Its walls glowed red in the sunset. The domes of its mosques shimmered with turquoise tiles that caught the fading light and turned the skyline into a painted canvas. From the minarets, the evening call to prayer echoed over the city, mixing with the fragrance of cinnamon, saffron, and clove rising from the great bazaars. In the libraries, scholars bent over manuscripts, translating Aristotle and Avicenna into Persian. In the caravanserais, traders counted profits from Chinese silk and Venetian glass, murmuring in a dozen different tongues. At the center of it all sat Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II, ruler of the Khwarazmian Empire. His dominion stretched from the shores of the Caspian to the banks of the Indus. On parchment maps, his borders dwarfed the kingdoms of Europe. Every caravan that crossed those lines paid him tolls. Every camel, every bale of silk, every sack of spice filled his coffers higher. To him, the world seemed secure. He had fortresses thick as mountains, soldiers stationed in every city, and wealth that could buy loyalty 10 times over. As for the nomads far to the east, those ragged tribesmen from Mongolia, selling hides and cheese on the frontier markets, how could they possibly threaten an empire of cities, books, gardens, and irrigation canals? Night in Samarkand was serene. In the palace, oil lamps flickered on silk drapes and glazed Persian tiles. Courtiers murmured over goblets of sweet wine. Outside the gates, water rushed through channels carved centuries earlier, feeding orchards and wheat fields. It felt eternal, as though nothing could disturb the rhythm of this empire. But like every kingdom that believes itself eternal, Khwarazm was walking into its own illusion. Far beyond the mountains, out across the grasslands where the wind howled like a living thing, a storm was gathering. Temujin, once a fugitive without a home, was now known as Genghis Khan. He had forged the feuding Mongol clans into a single machine. He had crafted laws, reorganized armies into units of 10, 100,000, 10,000. He had discovered how to move an entire people, herds, blacksmiths, wives, and children, at the speed of a cavalry charge. But in 1218, the Shah did not know or did not wish to believe. He trusted stone walls to keep out any threat. He trusted wealth to shield him from danger. He trusted precedent, centuries of history that said nomads might raid a border town, but could never topple a civilized empire. And so, when the last caravan of the day passed through Samarkand's gate, when the merchants sat down to hot tea in a dimly lit caravanserai, when the lamps of the mosques flickered against the night sky, no one thought disaster was close. They could not imagine that within 3 years, these streets would run black with blood, that the same libraries now glowing with lamplight would be emptied, their books carted off as plunder, that the very orchards fed by the ancient canals would be cut down and burned to ash. The spark had not yet been struck, but the shadow of the storm had already fallen. One decision, one insult to a foreign caravan, would soon turn the glory of Khwarazm into a warning whispered across centuries. Imagine now that we leave the bustling markets of Samarkand behind. The domes fade into the horizon, and the air thick with spice is replaced by something sharper, colder. The wind, the Mongolian steppe, a sea of grass rolling forever, under a sky so wide it seems to swallow the earth. Here, the nights are cruel, and the winters bite through bone. In this world, survival is not given. It is fought for every day, every season. It was here that a boy named Temujin was born, decades before he would be called Genghis Khan. His childhood was not the story of a prince cradled in silk, but of hunger gnawing the belly and wolves circling the camp. His father, poisoned by rivals. His mother, left to raise him and his siblings in poverty. At times, the family survived on wild roots, scraps of meat, or nothing at all. From that wilderness, Temujin learned lessons that no palace could teach. That loyalty is more precious than gold. That betrayal cuts deeper than any sword. That a man who cannot ride, shoot, or endure suffering has no place in this world. As he grew, Temujin bound followers not with promises of luxury, but with discipline and reward. If a man proved himself in battle, he was lifted, no matter his birth. If a man failed or betrayed, he was cast down, no matter his bloodline. It was a revolution in a world where rank had always come from family. Among the Mongols, under Temujin, it came from merit. Little by little, the tribes that once raided each other for cattle and women began to gather under his banner. He broke the cycle of vengeance that had torn them apart for generations, and with every tribe that joined, the storm on the steppe grew larger. By the time he was called Khan, Temujin had already reshaped the Mongols into something the settled empires had never seen before. Not just a horde of raiders, but a nation that moved as one. He organized them into tens, hundreds, thousands. Every man knew his place, every officer his command. Orders could pass through the ranks like lightning across the plain. And discipline was everything. A soldier who abandoned formation, even in victory, could be executed. A commander who disobeyed orders, no matter how powerful, could be stripped of rank and wealth. The law was the Khan's word, and the Khan's word was iron. Temujin also understood something deeper. That war was not only about men and horses. It was about information, supplies, and psychology. He built networks of scouts that could ride 100 miles in a day, reporting every movement of an enemy. He stockpiled arrows by the tens of thousands, dried meat by the ton, spare horses by the herd. His army did not need supply wagons. They carried their world with them. Wherever the Khan went, the nation went. Blacksmiths, shamans, families, herds. It was a civilization in motion, rolling like thunder across the grasslands. But Temujin's genius went beyond the steppe. He knew that nomad skill with the bow and horse was not enough to break cities of stone, so he absorbed what others could offer. From the north of China, he took siege engineers who built catapults, rams, and towers. From conquered peoples, he drew artisans and clerks, turning enemies into servants of his empire. Every defeat he suffered became a lesson, every victory a stepping stone, and soon, whispers spread far beyond Mongolia, of an army that never tired, of horsemen who could fire arrows in any direction at full gallop, of generals like Jeeb and Subutai, who could outmaneuver entire kingdoms with only a fraction of their forces. Wherever the Mongols went, they did not just raid, they remade the land in their image. To the Shah of Khwarazm, these were only distant rumors, stories carried by travelers, exaggerated by fear. He saw only ragged men from the east and dismissed them. But on the steppe, a boy who once starved in winter had become a master of nations. By 1218, Temujin was no longer simply a Khan of the Mongols. He was Genghis Khan, universal ruler. His banners flew over China's northern plains. His armies had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers that other men thought impassable. And now he looked west. The Silk Road beckoned, not for plunder, not for raids, but for empire. For the Khan understood something few rulers grasped. Trade was power. To control the caravans was to control the lifeblood of continents. So he prepared his approach to Khwarazm not with fire, but with courtesy. He gathered a caravan, loaded it with silks and furs, gifts and treasures. He sent it westward with a simple message: open the roads, let trade flow, let our peoples prosper together. A polite gesture, a gesture that could have enriched two empires, but at the far edge of the steppe, the Shah's arrogance would twist that gesture into an insult that could never be undone. Picture the scene. The steppe wind carried dust over the caravan. Dozens of camels, their backs heavy with silks and furs, trod carefully along the desert road. Beside them rode men chosen not for their swords, but for their words, envoys of Genghis Khan. It was the year 1218. They came not as conquerors, but as merchants, diplomats, guests. Their message was simple: open the roads, trade with us, let the caravans pass, let both sides grow rich. It was not a threat, it was an opportunity, for on the Silk Road, wealth flowed like a river, and whoever guarded its banks would prosper. But on the frontier of Khwarazm, power belonged to Governor Inalchuq of Otrar. He looked at the merchants and saw not partners, but spies. He looked at the silks and saw not gifts, but contraband. And above all, he looked at their presence as an insult, as if a nomad Khan could presume to speak to the Shah as an equal. So he gave an order that would echo across centuries. The goods were seized, the men accused. The entire caravan was executed. News of this massacre reached Samarkand. The Shah, Ala-ad-Din Muhammad II, was told. He might have punished Inalchuq. He might have sent apologies, gifts, even a single token of regret. But arrogance whispered otherwise. The Shah chose to double down. When Genghis Khan heard what had happened, he did not unsheath his sword. Not yet. He sent another envoy, a nobleman named Inalchuq, not to be confused with the governor, carrying a formal protest and a demand for justice. The Shah received him, and then, in a blaze of fury and pride, he ordered the ambassador's head struck from his shoulders. The rest of his entourage was burned alive. The severed head was placed in a sack and dispatched back east. A grotesque reply to the Khan's courtesy. Imagine the journey of that head, carried by riders through deserts and mountains, a mute message bouncing in its sack. The eyes gone, the lips curled into a silent warning. When it reached Genghis Khan, the storm broke. The Khan sat in silence. He had given courtesy, he had given trust, and his people had been slaughtered like dogs. He was a man who never forgot insult. And this insult would be repaid not in words, but in cities reduced to dust, in rivers choked with corpses, in empires erased. For Khwarazm, the die was cast. The merchants of Samarkand continued their trade, unaware. Children still played in the courtyards of Bukhara. Priests still recited verses in the mosques of Merv. But the judgment of the steppe was already on its way. A caravan had been murdered, an ambassador had been butchered, and for that, the wrath of Genghis Khan would soon descend. Faster, fiercer, and more merciless than anything the world had yet seen. The insult had been delivered. A caravan slaughtered, an ambassador butchered, and now, silence hung heavy on the steppe. But it was not an empty silence. It was the pause before a storm breaks. Genghis Khan did not rant or rave when the head of his envoy was laid before him. He did not curse the Shah aloud. Instead, he sat quietly, his face unreadable, his thoughts like arrows pulled taut against the bowstring. For the Khan, vengeance was not a burst of fire. It was a calculation, a campaign to be planned with the same care a hunter gives to tracking his prey. That year, 1219, the Mongolian heartland moved with an energy unseen before. Messengers galloped across the plains, carrying summons. From every corner of the steppe came warriors, men who had once been enemies, now bound under one banner. Every tribe that had bent the knee was called. Every ally was expected to send riders. Every man who could pull a bowstring was needed. The Khan ordered stockpiles built, as though he were feeding a nation, not merely an army. Tens of thousands of arrows were crafted, fletched with feathers, tipped with iron. Mountains of dried meat and curd were prepared, food that could last weeks in the saddle. Herds of spare horses were gathered. Each rider would not have one mount, but 3, sometimes 4. When one horse tired, another was waiting. It meant the Mongol host could ride longer, faster, and harder than any army in the world. And there was more. Siege engines, taken from Chinese campaigns, were dismantled, packed, and prepared for the march west. Stone throwers, scaling towers, rams, all designed to crack walls that nomads once rode past in frustration. Now, those walls would no longer be safe. In the camps, blacksmiths hammered through the night. The sparks from their forges lit the darkness like fireflies. Leatherworkers stitched quivers and saddles. Women boiled hides, shaping armor. Children herded sheep and horses, keeping the endless supply lines alive. This was not just an army gathering. It was an entire people bracing itself to move. The Mongols prepared not for a raid, but for war without restraint. A war not only to punish, but to annihilate. Meanwhile, in Samarkand, the Shah's court muttered with unease. Rumors drifted in with merchants and spies. They spoke of endless horsemen gathering on the horizon, of entire clans answering the call, of a wrath that moved like thunder over the plains. But the Shah dismissed them. He believed no nomad could breach his walls. He told his advisors the Mongols were too far, too scattered, too small. He trusted the stone of his fortresses, the wealth of his markets, the prayers of his scholars. And with each dismissal, the noose tightened. On the steppe, the Khan gathered his sons. Joki, Shagatai, Ogidi. He gave them commands, not as princes, but as generals. Each would lead wings of the army. Each would carry the burden of vengeance. And then there were his most trusted lieutenants. Jib, the arrow, swift and deadly. Subutai, the thinker, whose strategies were as precise as any blade. Together, they would stretch the campaign across thousands of miles, as if distance itself had no meaning. By the end of 1219, the host was ready. Some said it numbered 90,000. Others claimed 200,000. Enough to stretch from horizon to horizon, a living sea of horse and rider. When they moved, it was not with the chaos of a horde. It was with the rhythm of a machine. Scouts at the front, checking every stream, every ford. Engineers behind, hauling timber, shaping frames. Columns of riders flowing like rivers, each man knowing his place. And at the center rode Genghis Khan, silent, intent, the storm given human form. For the Khwarazmian Empire, time was almost gone. The spark had been lit. The preparations were complete. The Khan was coming. But in Samarkand, life went on as before. The bazaars rang with bargaining voices. The mosques filled with prayer. The libraries hummed with study. No one there believed that within a year, their streets would be black with ash, their orchards cut down, their blood soaking into the earth. The insult had been given, and the retribution was about to fall. The year turned, and with it, the steppe itself seemed to stir. Spring winds swept across the grasslands, bending the tall stalks like waves on a restless ocean. And from the east, The sound of hooves began to rise, not the scattered beat of raiders, but the steady thunder of a nation on the move. Genghis Khan had given the order. The host would march. Not a raid, not a skirmish, but a tide meant to wash an empire away. Imagine it, a column stretching farther than the eye could see, tens of thousands of horses, their manes whipping in the wind, men clad in leather and lamellar armor, bows slung across their shoulders, quivers packed with arrows fletched in silence through long winter nights. Each rider carried more than weapons. They carried the discipline of a lifetime, the pride of a clan, the vengeance of the Khan. And behind them followed not wagons, but life itself. Families, herds, smiths, shamans, the entire nation moving as though the earth itself had broken loose. This was no army in the sense that Khwarazm understood. This was a civilization in motion, rolling westward like a storm front. The first target was Otrar. It was fitting. It was here that the insult had been born. It was here that Mongol merchants had been cut down, their goods stolen, their lives wasted. Joki and Chagatai, sons of the Khan, rode at the head of the column that encircled its walls. They did not storm the gates at once. They settled in like hunters at a burrow's mouth, patient, relentless. No rider left the city, no supply came in. Every gate was sealed by patrols that could vanish into the horizon and return within hours. Inside the walls, Governor Inalchuk felt the noose tightening. The same man who had ordered the massacre now watched smoke rise from Mongol camps, heard the creak of wooden frames as engineers assembled catapults from timbers hauled 40 miles across the plains. He had brought this storm upon his people, and still he could not comprehend its scale. While Otrar shuddered, another arm of the Mongol host pressed westward. Genghis himself rode at its heart. Scouts swept ahead, mapping rivers, fords, and every line of approach. Columns shifted with practiced grace, splitting, converging, like fingers of a hand tightening into a fist. And always the pace. Faster than Khwarazmian scouts could follow, faster than messengers could carry warnings. The Mongols moved as though distance were nothing, as though deserts and mountains had become mere inconveniences. Villages along the frontier watched in terror. Some fled before the riders arrived, leaving only smoldering hearths behind. Others threw down their weapons, hoping for mercy. The Mongols spared those who yielded quickly, but burned those who resisted. The message spread faster than fire. Submit and live. Resist and vanish. In Samarkand, the Shah heard reports of Otrar under siege. He heard of Mongol detachments moving like shadows across his frontiers. But still, he believed this was only a raid. He told his generals to wait, to gather reinforcements from Merv and Herat. Time, he thought, would favor him. The nomads would falter before the walls, and negotiation would follow. It was a rational calculation, but it was the calculation of a man who did not yet understand his enemy. Back on the steppe, as the sun sank behind the horizon, the Mongol camps came alive with quiet order. Horses were watered, their sweat scraped clean with curved bone knives. Men sat around small fires, eating dried meat softened with mare's milk. Stories were told, but always in low voices. Above them, the stars blazed, endless and sharp, mirroring the countless eyes of riders who waited for dawn. And at the center, Genghis Khan sat apart. The flames lit his face, carving it in gold and shadow. He said little. He did not need to. Every man knew what lay ahead. The march had begun. The storm was rolling west, and the Khwarazmian Empire, in its palaces and gardens, still did not realize that the walls they trusted were already doomed to fall. The walls of Otrar rose from the plain like a defiant fist. Stone and clay, sun-baked and ancient, they had withstood raiders before. Behind them, Governor Inalchuk, the man whose arrogance had spilled the first Mongol blood, waited, confident that stone would succeed where courtesy had failed. But this was not a raid. This was the full weight of the Mongol machine. Joki and Chagatai, sons of Genghis Khan, led the host. They did not rush the gates. They spread their camps in a vast circle, a living noose tightening around the city. Watchfires blazed at night, so many that the horizon glowed red. Every road was cut, every well patrolled. The city was sealed, as surely as if the very earth had swallowed it whole. Inside, panic began to seep through the alleys. Merchants who had once grown fat on caravan trade now counted dwindling sacks of grain. Mothers carried water under the gaze of archers who lined the battlements. Children whispered of horsemen who could appear and vanish like ghosts. The Mongols were patient. They brought timbers from far away, hauling them on carts, shaping them into frames. Siege engines rose against the skyline, tall, skeletal shapes, alien to a city used to fighting raiders on horseback. Catapults creaked into place. Battering rams were rolled forward, covered in hides soaked in vinegar to resist fire. By day, The Mongols tested the walls with probing attacks, arrows loosed in clouds, ladders raised, shouts echoing against the stone. By night, they vanished into the darkness, only to reappear at dawn, their horses fresh, their faces unreadable. Inalchuck watched from the citadel. He had expected a flurry of raids, a sudden charge, perhaps even negotiation, but what he saw was something colder, more relentless, a siege designed not merely to break a wall, but to grind the spirit of a city into dust. Supplies shrank. The granaries, once overflowing, grew bare. Famine gnawed at the poor first, then at the merchants who had hoarded. Disease crept through the narrow streets, carried by hunger, filth, and fear. Still, the governor refused to yield. Pride chained him to the walls as surely as the Mongols' patrols barred the gates. Months passed. 5 long months of hunger, terror, and smoke. The defenders hurled stones and boiling oil from the battlements, their arms weary, their spirits failing. The Mongols pressed closer, each day sapping a little more of the city's strength. And then, in October, the walls cracked. The final assault was thunderous. Engines hurled stones that shattered towers. Arrows rained down so thick they darkened the sky. The Mongols surged forward, a tide of horse and foot, climbing ladders, battering gates, forcing their way into Otrar. The streets became rivers of chaos. Defenders fought house by house. But for every man cut down, 2 more Mongols poured in. Fires leapt from roof to roof. Smoke choked the alleys. The cries of women and children mingled with the clash of steel. Governor Inalchuck fled to the citadel, his last refuge. For days, he held out, surrounded by loyal retainers, watching the city burn below. But even stone cannot outlast fire and iron. When the citadel finally fell, the governor was dragged before the sons of Genghis Khan. Legend says his punishment was crafted to match his crime. He had killed Mongol merchants out of greed, coveting their gold and silk. So the Mongols answered in kind. They bound him, and into his ears and eyes they poured molten silver, a river of liquid wealth, the very symbol of avarice, becoming the instrument of death. Whether the tale is fact or myth, its message spread across the Silk Road. The Mongols repaid insult with terror, and no wall, no governor, no city could stand against them. When the fires of Otrar died down, nothing remained but ash and silence. The Mongol banners flew above the ruins, and the march west continued. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, all lay ahead. All would soon learn what Otrar had learned, that the storm did not pass. It consumed. When Otrar's ashes still smoked, the Mongol host did not pause. The storm rolled onward westward, toward the jeweled cities that had once been the pride of Khwarazm. At the edge of the desert stood Bukhara, a city of gardens and mosques, its markets heavy with carpets and spices, its people proud, its walls thick. For centuries, Bukhara had been a beacon of wealth and learning. Now it was a target. The Shah had left the city behind, believing its garrison strong enough, its walls high enough. He moved west, carrying his court like a man who thought he could outrun the storm. But storms do not wait. In early 1220, as the desert winds rose, Mongol columns swept toward Bukhara, but they did not come from where the defenders expected. Jib and Subutai, masters of maneuver, had led their troops through the unthinkable, across mountains, across barren land, through routes no scout had believed passable. And so, when the garrison of Bukhara looked east for the enemy, the Mongols appeared behind them, from the south, from the west, from the very horizon they thought safe. Horsemen rose, like mirages, made real. Panic spread, like fire through the streets. The people had trusted in walls, but what good are walls when the enemy already stands inside your gates? The defenders tried to rally, but Genghis Khan himself arrived at their head. And before battle was joined, he did something no conqueror had done before. He entered the great mosque. He gathered the trembling citizens, and from the pulpit where imams once preached, he spoke. His words were not shouted. They were calm, cold, heavy as iron. "O people," he said, "I am the scourge of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent me as your punishment." The people wept. Some begged. Some cursed. But all knew that their fate was sealed. The siege was short. The gates opened. The garrison surrendered, and the city fell into Mongol hands. What followed was terror, but also precision. Craftsmen and artisans were spared, sent eastward to serve the Khan. The rest of the population was divided among the soldiers. Many were killed outright. Others were enslaved. The streets of Bukhara, once filled with the sounds of trade, now echoed with screams and the crackle of fire. The city that had flourished for centuries was reduced in days to a husk. To those who witnessed it, the fall of Bukhara was more than a conquest. It was a revelation. The Mongols did not fight like other armies. They did not wait for the slow grind of siege. They struck from impossible directions, appearing where no one believed they could ride, and when they spoke, their words carried the weight of divine judgment. When the flames died down, when the last resistance had been crushed, Bukhara was no longer a jewel. It was a warning. The Mongols moved on. Their horses drank from the canals. Their banners snapped in the wind, and ahead lay Samarkand, the capital, the heart of the Khwarazmian Empire. The storm was only growing stronger. The smoke of Bukhara had barely drifted away when the Mongol banners turned south. Ahead lay Samarkand, capital of the Khwarazmian Empire, the pride of Central Asia, the crown jewel on the Silk Road. Its walls were thick, its gardens vast, its markets crowded with traders from every corner of the world. To the Shah, Samarkand was untouchable. To Genghis Khan, it was the heart he would stop beating. March 1220. The Mongol host arrived. They had crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers. Their horses were lean, their riders weathered, but their discipline had not cracked. If anything, hunger and hardship had sharpened them into steel. Inside Samarkand, more than 40,000 men stood ready. They were not mere militia. They were the Shah's chosen defenders, soldiers trained, armored, sworn to hold. They watched from the battlements, certain that no nomad could breach their city. The Mongols offered terms: surrender, pay tribute, and live. The city refused. The gates stayed shut. The people prayed. The Shah was gone, but they still believed. The siege began. Chinese engineers, brought from campaigns in the east, assembled great siege engines. Catapults rose from the plains, their arms creaking, ready to hurl boulders. Mangonels stood ready to spit jars of fire. Covered rams rolled forward, their hides soaked in vinegar to resist flame. Mongol horse archers circled the walls. They rode close, loosed clouds of arrows, and retreated before defenders could reload, over and over, until the ramparts bristled with shafts. The defenders fought bravely. Stones rained down, oil was poured, and still the attackers came on. Then, on the fifth day, the outer wall cracked. A section crumbled under the pounding of stones. The Mongols surged in, a river of men and horses flowing through the breach. The defenders reeled, but still held the inner gates. The next week, the garrison made a desperate choice. They sallied forth, pouring out of the city to meet the enemy in the open. But the open field was the Mongols' domain. Every orchard, every canal, every vineyard had already been scouted. Traps had been set. Ambushes waited. The elite cavalry of the Shah, his pride, his hammer, rode straight into a killing field. Arrows rained from every side. Horses screamed. Men toppled. Formations shattered. By sundown, the elite of Samarkand lay dead in the dust. The city's spirit broke. Samarkand capitulated. The gates opened, and the storm rolled in. Block by block, the people were sorted. Artisans, goldsmiths, masons, scribes were spared, marched eastward to serve in Mongol lands. The rest were divided among the soldiers, as spoils, as slaves. And then came the slaughter. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the earth drank so much blood that the soil stayed black into the next spring. Whether the numbers were truth or legend, the terror was real. The jewel of Central Asia was gone. Not polished, not bartered, not treasured. Shattered, its light extinguished. From the palace, once gleaming with wealth, smoke curled into the sky. From the mosques, once filled with prayer, came only silence. From the gardens, once rich with fruit and flowers, rose the stench of decay. Samarkand, the pride of Khwarazm, was now a warning carved in ash and stone. For the Mongols, it was not the end. It was only a step. The Khan's banners moved onward. Nishapur, Merv, Balkh, all waited in their path. The Shah fled further west, carrying his fear like a shadow. But shadows cannot outrun storms, and the storm was still gathering strength. When Samarkand fell, the Shah was not there. He had already fled. Once ruler of a realm that stretched from the Caspian to the Indus, Allah ad-Din Muhammad II was now a fugitive in his own empire. He rode westward with a dwindling retinue, servants, courtiers, bodyguards, the remains of a court trying to keep its dignity even as its world collapsed. Everywhere he went, cities trembled. When the Shah entered, their walls became temporary capitals. When he left, they became targets. At Nishapur, he tried to rally defenders, but whispers of Bukhara's fall, of Samarkand's slaughter, spread faster than his orders. Men deserted. Merchants hid their wealth. Even the loyal looked at him not as a king, but as a man already cursed. He moved again to Merv, then to Balkh, always westward, always further from the heart of his empire. The more he fled, the smaller his shadow became. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan unleashed his hounds. Two generals, Jeeb the arrow and Subutai the strategist, were given a task no army had ever been assigned before: pursue a single man to the ends of the earth. With only 20,000 riders, they fanned out across Persia and the Caucasus. Everywhere the Shah's name was spoken, the Mongols appeared within days. Every trail was followed, every rumor chased down. It was as though the Khan's eyes were in the very wind. The Shah begged for aid. He sent messengers to Baghdad, to the Caliph, who claimed to be the protector of Islam. He sent pleas to Delhi, to the Sultan who ruled the plains beyond the Indus. But the Mongol advance moved faster than his envoys. By the time his letters arrived, the news of his defeats had already reached the courts. No one wanted to tie themselves to a drowning man. In the towns where he lingered, the Shah tried to command. He ordered men to take up arms, to fortify, to resist. But his voice no longer carried weight. Even his sons questioned him. His army, once counted in tens of thousands, was now scattered bands, each more concerned with survival than loyalty. And so, city by city, the empire crumbled, not with the roar of battle, but with the silence of abandonment. By 1221, the Shah was a king in name only. He wandered through ruined halls, through half-empty tents, through palaces where servants whispered behind their hands. His most capable son, Jalal ad-Din, still tried to rally men, to fight, to carve a stand from the chaos. But the Shah himself seemed hollow, a man consumed by fear, haunted by the shadow of riders he could never escape. At last, he reached the shores of the Caspian Sea. There, on a lonely island, the fugitive king drew his final breath. No court, no banners, no empire. Only the wind, the waves, and the knowledge that he had led his people to ruin. He ordered his grave, kept secret, hidden from the Mongols, lest even in death he be mocked by the vengeance of the Khan. But vengeance did not need a grave. The empire was already gone, its heart burned at Samarkand, its jewels plundered, its people scattered or slain. The Shah's death was not an end, it was an afterthought. The true destruction had already been written, in ash, in blood, in the silence of abandoned cities. And still the storm rolled on. The Shah was dead, but Genghis Khan's punishment was not yet complete. The land itself would be broken, its fields would be torched, its canals destroyed, its very memory scraped from the earth. The fugitive king had fled to the sea, but his empire had no sea to hide in. The Shah was gone, dead on a lonely island in the Caspian Sea. But for the Mongols, his end was not the end of the war. Genghis Khan had given his generals a command: pursue him, break him, and let the world see what happens to those who spill Mongol blood. And so the pursuit began. Jib and Subutai, two of the greatest commanders in Mongol history, rode with 20,000 men. Compared to the armies of empires, it was a small host. But in their hands, it became a blade that cut across continents. They did not move like ordinary armies. They moved like shadows, like storms. Scouts rode days ahead. Columns split, only to rejoin miles later. Villages that thought themselves safe woke to the thunder of hooves. Everywhere the Shah's name had been spoken, Mongols appeared soon after, as if the wind itself carried his trail to them. The pursuit was not a straight line. It was a whirlwind that carved across Persia and the Caucasus. They rode into lands that had never seen Mongols before, over mountains, through river valleys, across deserts. They appeared where no enemy expected, always moving, always striking. Persian princes tried to rally their men, but the speed was impossible to match. By the time troops gathered, the Mongols had already moved on, burning towns, breaking armies, leaving behind only ruin and stories of terror. In city after city, the Shah's sons tried to raise banners in his name. They called men to arms, spoke of honor, of God, of resistance. But Mongol scouts were already watching. Mongol riders were already near, and one by one, those cities fell. Jalal ad-Din, the Shah's most capable son, still fought. He gathered what he could, an army pulled from the wreckage of an empire. He dreamed of a stand, a final blow to slow the tide. But the tide could not be slowed. The pursuit itself became legend. For a year, Jib and Subutai chased not only the remnants of Khwarazm, but every force that tried to rise in its shadow. They struck at Persians, Georgians, Armenians. They crossed into the Caucasus, defeating princes who thought themselves far from the storm. They crossed rivers swollen with meltwater. They scaled mountains sharp as knives. And always the same pattern: speed, surprise, annihilation. It was a campaign unlike any the world had seen. Not conquest for land, but pursuit as punishment. The message was simple, written in fire and blood. No insult to the Khan could be hidden. No distance could protect you. No wall, no city, no mountain could give shelter. The Shah's body lay in a secret grave, but his empire was dying 1,000 deaths, scattered across valleys and plains, each defeat another nail in the coffin of Khwarazm. When the pursuit finally slowed, the world was forever changed. From the Caspian shores to the passes of the Caucasus, people whispered the same thing. The Mongols were not men. They were fate. They were punishment sent from heaven. And no ruler who crossed them could escape. The Shah had fled to the sea. His sons had scattered. His people had burned. His empire, once invincible, was gone. But Genghis Khan was not finished. The storm would turn again, southward, eastward, westward. For Khwarazm was only one lesson. The world had many more to learn. The Shah was gone. The empire had no center, no commander, no shield. But for Genghis Khan, vengeance was not complete. The insult of Otrar had demanded more than the fall of Bukhara, more than the humiliation of Samarkand. It demanded erasure. The Mongol banners turned toward the great cities of Khwarazm, the ones whose names had once shone across the Silk Road. Merv, Nishapur, Urgench, places called mothers of the world, where libraries overflowed, where gardens stretched like emerald seas, where scholars debated beneath domes of turquoise tile. They would soon be silent. At Merv, the people hoped for mercy. The gates opened without a fight. Tens of thousands poured into the squares, offering tribute, placing their trust in surrender. For a moment, hope flickered. But Genghis Khan had decreed punishment, and punishment was total. The population was driven outside the walls. Chroniclers say 400,000 souls. Perhaps an exaggeration, but even half that number staggers the mind. They were divided among the soldiers, each man ordered to kill. The ground was soon a sea of bodies, the air filled with a silence more terrible than screams. The city that had once been the mother of the world was gone in a single week. At Nishapur, the story was the same, but darker still. A son-in-law of Genghis Khan had been slain during the fighting. The Khan's daughter demanded vengeance, and vengeance she received. When the walls fell, the killing did not stop with soldiers. Women, children, scholars, poets, all were put to the sword. The streets ran red, and then black, as blood soaked the earth. Afterward, the bodies were piled high. Pyramids of skulls rose outside the gates, white monuments to terror. For generations, travelers would point to them, and whisper of the storm that had passed. Urgench, jewel of the Oxus, was next. Its canals watered fields for miles. Its bazaars overflowed with silk and spice. But wealth could not save it. The Mongols broke its walls, drowned its streets in fire and blood, and tore apart its irrigation canals. The fields that had fed empires turned to desert. The gardens vanished. The city that had once been a heartbeat of the Silk Road was reduced to silence. This was not conquest as the world had known it. Conquest had always meant rulers replaced, taxes collected, but cities endured. The Mongols rewrote that rule. For them, conquest was annihilation, a lesson written in ash. Never again insult the Khan. And so the Silk Road, once the artery of trade and culture, lay shattered. Libraries gone, markets gone, mosques and minarets toppled into ruin. Canals collapsed, fields salted with blood. The land itself bore scars that would take generations to heal. Yet from that devastation came a new order. When the Mongols finally rode north again, they left not only ruin, but a message carved deep into the memory of nations. That under the Khan's law, caravans would move again, but only under his protection. The Shah's empire had been erased. Its cities turned to smoke, its people to shadows, and in their place rose something new. The Pax Mongolica, a world where one ruler, one law, one empire, controlled the flow of trade from China to the Mediterranean. The punishment of Khwarazm was complete. The insult of Otrar had been answered, not with the death of one man, but with the death of millions. And the world, watching from Baghdad, from Delhi, from Constantinople, understood. The storm from the steppe could not be ignored. It could only be feared. When the storm finally passed, the Khwarazmian Empire was no more. Its Shah dead in exile. Its cities emptied, burned, erased. Its people scattered to the winds, some as slaves, some as refugees, many as nameless bones beneath the ruins. The land that had once pulsed with the heartbeat of the Silk Road lay quiet. The orchards gone, the canals broken, the libraries turned to ash. The mother of the world had been struck barren. Yet the Mongols did not leave only destruction. Out of the silence, they imposed order. Caravans that had once paid tolls to Khwarazm now moved beneath the banner of the Khan. One law, one ruler, one vast empire stretching farther than Rome had ever dreamed. Merchants soon discovered that under Mongol protection, they could ride from China to the Black Sea, without fear of bandits, without bribing officials at every border. Passports written in the Khan's script guaranteed safe passage. Markets reopened, slowly, under a new master. The Silk Road had been broken, and then reforged in Mongol hands. But for those who remembered, the lesson was carved too deep to forget. At Merv, The wind still whispered over empty ground where gardens once bloomed. At Nishapur, pyramids of skulls gleamed white in the sun. Monuments no mason had built. Monuments no one dared to tear down. At Urgench, the canals lay dry. The fertile soil turned back into desert. The message was clear. The Khan's wrath was not a storm you could weather. It was annihilation. The scholars who survived carried the tale far. In Baghdad, men of learning recounted the burning of libraries. In Delhi, rulers listened with unease to stories of walls that had crumbled in days. In Europe, rumors grew of horsemen from the east, a scourge so fast, so merciless, that kings and popes whispered of the world's end. And at the heart of every rumor was the same truth. An insult to the Mongols had destroyed a civilization. For Genghis Khan, the punishment of Khwarazm was not only vengeance. It was demonstration, a warning carved into the bones of a continent. This is what awaits those who defy me. And the warning worked. When his envoys rode west in later years, bearing letters sealed with his mark, many rulers bent the knee before the first arrow was loosed. They remembered the ashes of Merv. They remembered the silence of Samarkand. Today, the ruins remain. Fragments of walls, collapsed domes, scattered stones half buried in desert sand. Tourists walk where once hundreds of thousands lived, their footsteps echoing on streets long emptied. The Khwarazmian Empire, once master of trade and treasure, is remembered mostly for its fall, for a single decision, the execution of a caravan, that set in motion the greatest act of retribution the medieval world had ever seen. And so, in the end, the lesson endures. No empire, however rich, is beyond ruin. No wall, however thick, is beyond breach. No ruler, however proud, is beyond fear. On the Silk Road, amid the shifting sands, the ghosts of Khwarazm whisper the truth to every passing traveler. That glory is fleeting, that arrogance is fatal, and that once long ago, a storm from the steppe came and erased a world.